My name is John OCallaghan. I teach philosophy here at the University of Notre Dame, and I direct the Jacques Maritain Center, and it is a great pleasure of mine to introduce to you Ralph Wood, an old friend of Notre Dame's. In fact, he's a very old friend of David Solomon's. I think he has been coming up here to give talks for David ever since they printed the programs on slate and lit the rooms with oil. Nonetheless, every time he has come, it has been extraordinary. The last time he came, he gave a talk on Flannery O'Connor in which he sang a few Protestant hymns. And I don't know if it was because we're Catholic or because we're Yankees that he thought we had never heard the old rugged cross. He's going to be speaking about Mary, but only after I list some of his extraordinary achievements. But he's going to be speaking about Mary, so I'm sort of hoping that he might treat us with a little bit of the Salve Regina, which I'll help if you have a difficulty with that. Ralph C. Wood, University Professor of Theology and Literature at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, since 1998, holds BA and MA degrees from Texas A&M University, Commerce, as well as MA and PhD degrees from the University of Chicago, non-commerce. Prior to Baylor, he served for 26 years on the faculty of Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where he was the John Allen Easley Professor of Religion. Among his many books, there's The Comedy of Redemption, Christian Faith and Comic Vision in Four American Novelists, Contending for the Faith, The Church's Engagement with Culture, The Gospel According to Tolkien, Visions of the Kingdom in Middle-earth, Flannery O'Connor and the Christ-Haunted South, Literature and Theology, and Preaching and Professing, Sermons by a Teacher Seeking to Proclaim the Gospel. He is now at work on a book to be entitled G.K. Chesterton and the Nightmare Goodness of God. Today he will be speaking on The Lady Who Looks on Gladiators in Grapple, Chesterton's Marian Poems, and I hope the result of this is that the University of Notre Dame will place on a plaque on the side of the stadium Chesterton's poem, The Arena. I give you Ralph Wood.
Thank you, John, very much for that introduction. Exceedingly kind. It's always a delight to be back at Notre Dame. My wife.
Ralph told me to make sure there is a handout.
Yes, and there's a handout also right beneath the microphone on this side for those of you in the balcony if you don't have one. And they're at both doors back here if you don't have one. Well, my wife Suzanne and I are having a wonderful reunion weekend with so many friends we made at Notre Dame 3 years ago when we spent that year at the Center for Ethics and Culture. It was a glorious year for us, and our memories of that year are so fine that to be renewing them this weekend is really a great delight. I begin and will end with the hope of your indulgence, perhaps even a plenary indulgence, of my venturing way, way out of my depth. I did finally complete the book on Chesterton that John OCallaghan mentioned, be out this spring, but I did not include this section because I was, as I suggest, over my head, because I'm venturing into Mariology, a place where only Catholics would dare to go like angels, but fools would indeed, like me, a Baptist, tread. George Lindbeck, some of you know, I'm going to try to talk this paper insofar as possible and not simply read it to you. And I might begin, though, with a quote from Chesterton, who said that the average modern man, woman, is very much like a businessman, a sleepy businessman, right after lunch. So some of you, like me, are just after breakfast and perhaps a bit sleepy, so I will try my best to talk and not only read this paper. George Lindbeck, many of you will know, a very fine Lutheran theologian, is probably the most ironic of the ecumenical theologians of our time. And he has said, I think quite rightly, that the Marian dogmas will be the great blocking obstacle between Rome and the Protestant world, having not only serious dialogue with each other, but what we, of course, all hope for is reunion with each other, that Christ's body might indeed be made one. But it's not just Lindbeck who makes that point. Even von Balthasar makes that point. He indicates that it's a problem even for Catholics, these Marian dogmas. He says, for example, that the phrase included in every creed of the church, born of the Virgin Mary, is, and I quote him, a great theater of war. And what he has in mind, of course, and I'm pointing out what he points out, the obvious difficulty that if the second person of the Trinity is indeed to become fully human, then why is there not a fully human conception of that second person? He points out the difficulties already present in Scripture with that great claim, born of the Virgin Mary. It's obviously a late doctrine that neither Mark nor Paul seems to know anything about. Mary herself appears to be already the wife of Joseph. And of course, there are many references to Jesus' brothers in the New Testament, even if the Greek word adelphoi can refer to distant kinsmen and not simply to immediate siblings. Well, this is obviously not the place to go into that great theater of war, but it may be, I hope, an opportune moment to examine the ecumenical aspects, seems to me implicit in G.K. Chesterton's reading of those great dogmas, and especially to honor his own abiding devotion to Our Lady. And that's a phrase I hope my fellow Protestants will learn to use and not to be embarrassed by. And our little euphemism is Madonna, or the Madonna. And Chesterton points out what is really ludicrous as well as quite ungrammatical about that. That's like saying, the My Lady. Really stupid. Nor is Chesterton's own devotion to the Holy Virgin prompted by any kind of pious longing for motherly comfort, the usual Protestant canard about sentimental Marianism. It springs instead from Chesterton's estimate of her as the Theotokos, the God-bearing mother of Jesus, who is also the mother of his body, called the church. And so to explore this Chestertonian estimate, we need to take a first kind of byway into Chesterton's great debt to the now blessed John Henry Newman, and then as well on that little byway to look briefly at Lumen Gentium, the crucial document from the Second Vatican Council that deals with Marian matters. And then I believe we'll be better prepared to examine these two very important Marian poems that I have had duplicated for you. The first of them, of course, being the Nativity, and the second being the poem that Chesterton wrote in devotion and honor of not only Our Lady herself, but of the university named for her. The place to begin in understanding Chesterton's devotion to Mary, I think, is in the novel called The Ball and the Cross. How many of you, I assume I'm preaching to the choir, how many of you read Chesterton? almost everyone. If you haven't read Chesterton, please begin, not with orthodoxy, the standard place that Protestants all begin with, but with the ball and the cross. It's all there in that thin little magnificent novel of 1909. But in that novel, we have an opposition between a Scots Catholic named Evan McKeon and an English atheist named James Turnbull. And McKeon is trying to persuade the atheist Turnbull, who is a thoroughgoing scientific physicalist, a term that Alistair McIntyre taught me to use, not materialist. Christians are never against matter. Our Lord became matter. But physicalism, which reduces everything simply to physical causation, he's trying to convince him that Christianity itself is a body of objective knowledge. It's a way of knowing that should be honored in the public sphere just as much as scientific knowledge is honored. And that, of course, is a crucial matter for our own time. As you know, theological knowledge is not permitted in our courts of law. That's considered merely private opinion, and therefore not to be introduced. Well, Chesterton saw what was coming already. If you do that, if you make Christianity simply private opinion, it's lost. And so McKeon is trying to convince Turnbull that Christianity has just as great as, if not greater than, status as objective knowledge, as I say, knowledge with a clear object, with 2,000 years of elaboration of that knowledge by way of doctrines and practices and teachings, and therefore not to be dismissed as mere private superstitious opinion. So here's what he says to Turnbull. Remarkable, 1909. There are only two things that really progress, and they both accept accumulations of authority. They may be progressing uphill or down. They may be growing steadily better or steadily worse, but they have steadily advanced in a certain definable direction, and there are only two of these things, it seems, that ever can so progress. The first is strictly physical science. The second is the Catholic Church. You can see what already he's doing. He's wanting to say that the church is not a retrograde institution fixed to a frozen past, but that Christianity, very much like science, moves forward. It, in a real sense, progresses by way of engaging antecedent experience with present concerns, and thereby formulating doctrines and principles that require constant modification, constant enlargement. And so here's his concluding statement to Turnbull. If you want an example of anything which has progressed in the moral world by the same method as science in the material world, by continually adding to, without unsettling, what was there before, then I say there is only one example, and that is us, uppercase U, us, i.e. the Roman Catholic Church. Well, McKeon is clearly echoing John Henry Newman's idea of development. Chesterton very clearly is steeped in Newman, knows him inside out. And let me rehearse briefly what you all know about Newman. That is, he holds that the original divine disclosure given to the church by God in Christ and through the Holy Spirit, and of course that divine disclosure having its written form in Scripture, is the acorn of Christian revelation, so to speak. An acorn that then continues to ramify into the great oak tree of Christian doctrine, so that what is originally implicit is being made ever more explicit. Developments in dogma exfoliate the seed of faith, often in new and surprising ways, but notice they unsettle the past only as newly emerging scientific theories also unsettle the past, namely by deepening and extending the past. Obvious examples are Trinity and Incarnation. Neither of them made explicit in the New Testament, yet the Church, of course, having rightly developed them, these doctrines, as already having been present in nous and now necessarily exfoliated. Even the Marian dogmas, those doctrines that seem furthest removed from biblical attestation and Christocentric focus, are the logical outworkings of the church's tradition. So, Newman. Of all the major doctrines of the church, and this is, I think, one of Newman's most brilliant insights, only one of those major dogmas are the result of ordinary worship and practice of lay people, monks, nuns, and priests presiding at the Mass. And that is, of course, the Marian dogma, first formulated at the Synod of Ephesus in 431, though it seems to have been around at least since the early 2nd century. So that dogma arose out of the life of the church, not out of a theological quandary that had to be settled, but out of the church's own life and practice. And it's there, of course, in 431 that Mary is declared the Theotokos, the Mother of God, the God-bearer. In a series of lectures published in 1850 and entitled Difficulties of Anglicans, Chesteron declared, and I quote him, that when we once have mastered the idea that Mary bore, suckled, and handled the eternal, uppercase E, in the form of a child, what limit is conceivable to the rush and flood of thoughts which such a doctrine involves? What awe, what surprise must attend upon the knowledge that a creature has been brought so close to the divine essence? He points out, for example, Newman does, that the indissoluble bond linking the Virgin and the child is not a novum, not a new thing. It's figured over and again in the catacombs. And I quote Newman, Mary is there drawn with the divine infant in her lap. She with hands extended in prayer, he with his hand in the attitude of blessing. No representation can more forcibly convey the doctrine of the high dignity of the mother. And I will add of her influence with the Son. So what begins and seems initially to be minimal turns out, of course, to be ever more increasingly maximal in the tradition. And therefore we need to attend, it seems to me, we Protestants, along with our Catholic brothers and sisters, to a re-examination of Mary's place in the larger economy of the church and of our common life together. Now, nimbly leaping a mere 15 centuries, we can nonetheless come to consider the Mother of God as she was considered in the Second Vatican Council, exactly where I think as a Protestant she should have been considered, in the dogmatic constitution on the church, Lumen Gentium. There the council makes clear that Mary occupies a place in the church which is the highest after Christ, and yet very close to us. Seeking to avoid alienating the separated brethren, that is the graciously denominated term that we Protestants now have, former heretics, of course, the council exhorts theologians and preachers of the church to, I'm quoting, abstain zealously, both from all gross exaggerations as well as from petty narrow-mindedness in considering the singular dignity of the Mother of God. Let them, these preachers and theologians, rightly illustrate the duties and privileges of the Blessed Virgin, which always look to Christ, the source of all truth, sanctity, and piety. Earlier, the authors of Lumen Gentium had declared, and I quote again, that while she far surpasses all other creatures, both in heaven and on earth, she also belongs to the offspring of Adam, who must be saved. And thus that she too is redeemed by reasons of the merits of her Son. Of course, we have here a very fine echo of Dante's poignant and paradoxical description of Mary as filia del tuo figlio, daughter of your Son. So, all of the exalted titles ascribed to Mary, Theotokos, daughter of Zion, Stella Maris, Queen of the universe, the immaculately conceived, the perpetually virgin, the bodily assumed, the new Eve, the advocate, the auxiliatrix, these are new terms for me, the adjutrix, the mediatrix, though not yet co-redemptrix, these noble honorifics all derive from her utterly humble and faithful life. And I quote again from Lumen Gentium. The Father of mercies willed that the incarnation should be preceded by the acceptance of her who was predestined to be the mother of his Son, so that just as a woman contributed to death, Eve, so also a woman should contribute to life, the new Eve. In giving her full and free consent to the word of God spoken by Gabriel, Mary's fiat, not an Italian automobile, becomes the motto of every Christian. Be it done unto me according to thy word. The Blessed Lady is no mere passive recipient of divine grace. On the contrary, she actively participates in her salvation, just as we too are meant to work out our own salvation in fear and trembling. Many of us Protestants have learned from the Eastern Church rightly to regard theosis as the mark of the Christian life. That is to say, we are meant so fully to participate in God's own triune life as to be made divine. And perhaps it's also time for Protestants to recognize Mary as the first and exemplary believer, the one who, and I'm quoting from the document one last time, the one who in this singular way cooperated in her obedience, faith, hope, and burning charity in the work of the Savior in giving back supernatural life to souls. Wherefore, she is our mother in the order of grace. And I think we could take up that task, though I don't have time, obviously, to do so now, through the work of N.T. Wright. Most of you know that Wright has radically challenged what is often seen to be the Protestant doctrine of justification, which makes us absolutely passive recipients before divine grace, to pick up and emphasize strongly the necessity of our rightful cooperation with divine grace. Paul says we're, after all, sunergoi with Christ. We're co-workers with Christ. In fact, Wright comes at one point to say, in a way that really gets under the skin of some Protestants, remember, we are saved by works. And of course, he means by that works done by way of God's grace, but works indeed. Two drastic conclusions then follow. And I have to say, these are what I've learned most radically from my Catholic friends, many of whom are in this room. I learned a long time ago, actually not from them, but from my hero, a Baptist preacher in North Carolina named Warren Carr, that you cannot speak of Jesus Christ without speaking of his church, and that there's no such thing as a Christian apart from the body of Christ. That whatever Paul says, ein Christo, in the New Testament, he does not mean some private, personal, inward, as we say at Baylor, parking Jesus. One who gets us parking places, you have at Notre Dame, touchdown Jesus. And given the record of Baylor football until recently, and not imitating the Notre Dame football record of recent times, we would prefer touchdown Jesus. These two drastic conclusions then follow. This is what I've learned from my Catholic friends. We cannot speak of Christ without speaking of his mother. Nor can we speak of Christ's church without honoring Mary's mothering of it. as well. In his various Obiter Dicta concerning Our Lady, Chesterton confirms these two central claims. In The Everlasting Man, late work, important work by Chesterton, he recounts a really bizarre incident that occurred in his childhood Church of England parish, which got all hot and bothered over Mariolatry as figured in the Blessed Virgin holding the Christ child. So these new Latter-day iconoclasts went into, with the, of course, order of the parish, the church to that statue and barbarously removed the Christ child, chipped it away from the arms of the Holy Mother. And here's Chesterton's acidic commentary on this passingly strange event. One would think that this act was even more corrupted with Mariolatry, unless the mother was counted less dangerous when deprived of a sort of weapon. So Jesus is her AK-47, so you take that away from her, she's less harmful. But the practical difficulty is also a parable. You cannot chip away the statue of a mother from all around that of a newborn child. You cannot suspend the newborn child in midair. Indeed, you cannot really have a statue of a newborn child at all. Similarly, you cannot suspend the idea of a newborn child in the void or think of him or her without thinking of his mother, her mother. You cannot visit the child without visiting the mother. You cannot, in common human life, approach the child except through the mother. And so if we're to think of Christ in this aspect at all, we must admit, if only as we admit it in an old picture, that those two holy heads are too near together for the halos not to mingle and cross. Well, these aureoles around the heads of the Blessed Virgin and our Lord mix and mingle and cross, I think, beautifully in these two poems, the Nativity and the Arena. So let's turn to them, if you will. Does everybody have a copy? I want to make sure we have plenty, I think. Very good. Very good. Well, Chesterton is really at his best in his Christmas verse. And I'm reading only one of the Christmas poems, the one that's the best, I think, but there are many other Christmas poems. And Chesterton is supremely a Christmas poet because he's also a great devotee of Charles Dickens. He wrote what remains, I think, the very best book on Dickens. And that's a book that secular critics also regard as the very best way to begin reading Dickens. For what Dickens did, Chesterton says, almost single-handedly, was to recover this feast, this holy feast, for the entire Anglophone world after the Puritans had almost succeeded for more than 2 centuries in suppressing it as the ultimate display of papist paganism. You probably know that the feast we're about to celebrate next Thursday was the Puritan attempt to suppress Christmas. Thanksgiving was meant to be the Protestant substitute for Christmas, so we wouldn't even be tempted to think about Christmas. My favorite example of how near that attempt came to succeeding is from a friend of mine at Wake Forest, now alas long dead, who was doing his doctorate at the University of Edinburgh in 1947, George Griffin. And on Christmas morning, George and Lib Griffin looked out their window in Edinburgh, cold, gray, to see the street sweepers at work. An ordinary work day, Christmas, 1947. So it was the rather not very Protestant Dickens who knew almost from the start that this, note well, is not the feast of the Incarnation, but the feast of Nativity. Once more, I've learned from my Catholic friends that until very recently, the incarnation referred to the entire life and ministry of Christ, from conception to birth to maturity to teaching to death to resurrection to ascension. That whole thing is the incarnation. And therefore, the feast of the incarnation is March 25, not December 25, because the incarnation has its real inception and conception on that day. So Chesterton is rightly naming it the Feast of the Nativity. Our Latinate friends get it right. We were in Italy, it's La Natività. Spain, La Navidad. No Christmas at all there in that term. So we begin with this poem from 1897. This is when Chesterton is just beginning to call himself a Christian. This is what's so remarkable from what he can foresee about the significance of this event, when he's really, by largely the influence of his not yet wife, Francis, to become a Catholic, but already identifying himself as a Christian, it seems to me, sees to the very heart of the matter. So let's look at that poem, if you will. Notice that the Bethlehem scene is not at all idealized. You have to learn to listen to the trochees of Chesterton. Chesterton, like the poet of Beowulf, very much like Gerard Manley Hopkins, and supremely like J.R.R. Tolkien, did not think iambic rhythm to be the fundamental pattern of English speech. We do not speak da-da, 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 although great poetry has been written in that metric. He felt that the natural form is English is always the reverse. Da-da, da-da, da-da-da. And so listen to these trochees that we'll be hearing. If you don't mind, I'm going to read the entire poem. The thatch on the roof was as golden, though dusty the straw was and old. The wind had a peal as of trumpets, though blowing and barren and cold. The mother's hair was a glory, though loosened and torn. For under the eaves in the gloaming, a child was born. Have a myriad children been quickened? Have a myriad children grown old? Grown gross and unloved and embittered? Grown cunning and savage and cold? God abides in a terrible patience, unangered, unworn. And again, for the child that was squandered, a child is born. What know we of eons behind us? Dim dynasties lost long ago. Huge empires like dreams unremembered. Huge cities for ages laid low. This at least, that with blight and with blessing, with flower and with thorn, love was there, and his cry was among them, a child is born. Though the darkness be noisy with systems, dark fancies that fret and disprove, still the plumes stir around us, above us the wings of the shadow of love. Oh, princes and priests, have you seen it grow pale through your scorn? Huge dawns sleep before us, deep changes. The child is born. And the rafters of toil still are gilded with the dawn of the stars of the heart. And the wise men draw near in the twilight, who are weary of learning and art. And the face of the tyrant is darkened, his spirit is torn. For a new king is enthroned, yea, the sternest, a child is born. And the mother still joys for the whispered first stir of unspeakable things, still feels that high moment unfurling red glory of Gabriel's wings. Still the babe of an hour is a master whom angels adorn. Emmanuel, prophet, anointed, a child is born. And thou, that art still in thy cradle, the sun being crowned for thy brow, make answer, our flesh, make an answer. Say, whence art thou come? Who art thou? Art thou come back to earth for our teaching? To train or to warn? Hush. How may we know? Knowing only a child is born. You see that the Bethlehem scene is not at all idealized. We are shown instead a stable that's externally golden with the setting sun, but inside it's cold, chilled, drafty, lifeless. And in full accord, Chesterton again intuits everything, of the ancient tradition that a woman's most erotic quality are her tresses, her hair, her most erotic feature. The sinless virgin's hair is wondrous, but also disheveled. For here is a woman in the pangs of childbirth. In full consent to the divine will, she consents for her hair to be torn as she thrashes in agony. Perhaps her flesh is also ripped as the infant is brought forth from her womb. Here, and for here only, Chesterton resorts to the past tense in describing the birth of Jesus. A child was born. All the other stanzas conclude with the present tense affirmation. For because this child is born to this woman in this way, every child's birth now acquires new significance. The human race no longer repeats itself in an endless and weary iteration of the engine of animal reproduction. Because this one divine child subsumes the whole of humanity in his nativity, every newborn is now meant to be reborn. Hence Chesterton's crucial replacement of the expected definitive article, the child, with the surprising and indefinite, a child. Now, in this claim that Christ assumes the whole of humanity within himself, Chesterton is both echoing the teaching of the ancient church and anticipating the work of the Nouvelle Theologie. Its most characteristic exponent, Henri de Lubac, insists that human nature is not one thing here and another thing elsewhere. However twisted and tarnished, every person bears the imprint of God as a result both of their creation and their redemption in Christ. Humanity consists, therefore, of a bodily, no less than a spiritual whole. We cannot violate one person without violating every other person. For to desecrate even one child is to desecrate them all. Now, I'm quoting de Lubac. The divine image does not differ from one individual to another. In all, it is the same divine image. Our embodied souls, our ensouled bodies, display our shared human dependence, our singleness as a race, our commonality that makes us, and I'm quoting de Lubac, so entirely one that we ought not to speak of man in the plural any more than we speak of three gods. Hence the teaching of St. Augustine that we are, quote, one spiritual family intended to form the one city of God. The effect, therefore, of the incarnation, it follows, is all-encompassing. And I'm quoting de Lubac for a final time. Christ, from the very first moment of his existence, i.e. his conception, no less than his nativity, virtually bears all men within himself. For the Word did not merely take a human body. His incarnation was not a simple corporatio, but as St. Hilary of Poitiers says, a concorporatio. He incorporated himself in our humanity, and he incorporated our humanity in his humanity. Chesterton gets this in 1897 when he's read very little, if any, Catholic doctrine. And so he rightly shifts, it seems to me, rightly, the verb from the past tense to the present in the second and all of the following stanzas. For in this one birth, we now have the measure of every other birth. for good, of course, and for ill. In the second stanza, therefore, it becomes very clear that we can see now for the first time the horror and the waste of much human birthing. The promise that's heralded by the infant's first motion within its mother's womb, the quickening, is brought not to a long and happy life, but to a long and living death. The child becomes the father of the man in a very horribly unwordsworthian way. Instead of reaching a healthy maturity, he becomes passively withdrawn, alienated, void of all sensibility. Or else he becomes aggressively crass and clever and heartless, all for the want of the love that both conceived and birthed this one baby. Yet notice, not one of Chesterton's stanzas ends in dejection, as the final lines always turn back to the hope now resident in the birth of every child. For God has waited with a frightening forbearance, as Chesterton's dactyl and trochee serve to reverse the rhythm, unangered, unworn, in announcing God's refusal to grow weary and angry with human depravity. Here's the key. Not a single castaway child is excluded from the compass of his mercy. Whether in time irrevocably past, irrecoverably past, or in time all too pressingly present, every child is reclaimed with this child's birth. Notice in the third stanza, the measure of the Nativity is not only historical, it's also personal. The long unfurling course of human history is much too long to be recalled in all of its terrible successiveness. Mighty civilizations have risen and collapsed beyond all discovering, indeed all remembering. Yet one thing can still be assured. Amidst these endless cycles of time, where, to borrow a phrase from John Milton, most children are no sooner blown than blasted, we can be confident of this good news, of this weeping love child and his mother, was also proclaimed in the wail of these numberless and nameless newborns. They may have been conceived under the worst of all conditions, even rape. But Christ's birth stretches backwards, no less than forward, to lay claim on every human being. Chesterton's tropes shift from the personal and historical to the luminous and the tenebrous in the fourth and fifth stanzas. As the gloaming passes into nightfall, despite, and this is applicable to this roomful, the loud clamor made by logical thinkers and political actors, despite the worried fantasies of those who can only negate, despite the withering contempt shown by high officials, notice Chesterton, of the church and the state alike. The quiet motion of angel feathers, first heard by Mary, can be felt again hovering over this rude stable. The sun rising afresh over the Bethlehem stall is the dawn that will soon break upon the entire world, awakening men and women from their terrible slumbers. This day spring from on high will be a great light to illuminate all who dwell in darkness, both the peasant shepherds who watch the world's sheep by night, but also those eastern wizards whose minds have been dimmed, both, notice, dimmed by their creativity, their art, no less than their erudition, their learning. Most especially will these piercing rays strike the tyrant, whose visage is now as livid as his soul. And I owe this insight to my friend, Father John Fortin. Whereas Mary's hair was torn by her gracious consent, Herod's countenance is involuntarily ripped, as if to anticipate the veil that will be torn in the temple. Like the Christ child in Chesterton's parish church, chipped away by Philistines who feared the virgin holding him, so will this helpless infant king become God's curious weapon. This helpless infant, ruling from a bed of straw, will lance the world's will to power with the strength that comes from weakness. Hence the poem's rightful return in the final two stanzas to the Marian moment of the Nativity. Though she's still weary with the pangs of parturition, her delight remains so strong that Chesterton must do what I forbid my students to do. He converts a noun into a verb. I tell my students, do not verb your nouns. That's about the level of laughter I get at most of my jokes. Pitiful. Nothing less than the Marian act of joying can describe the Annunciation that came to her in a voice that, though proffering the seemingly impossible, was even less coercive than the light touch of angelic wings. What cannot possibly happen has indeed happened. The infant, whose umbilical cord is still drying, must already be accorded the munus triplex, first formulated by Eusebius, the trifold office of Christ's earthly ministry. The priest who makes God with us in the flesh, makes God present with us in the flesh. The prophet who pronounces God's judgment in terrible mercy. And the king whose chrism enables him rightly to break down the gates of hell and to set its satanic subjects free, all because a child is born. Then, the extraordinary turn of the final stanza, where the poet anonymously addresses, this is, I'm venturing here, I may get rightly corrected in question time. The poet anonymously addresses the infant himself. He's no longer mewling and puking, as Shakespeare says, but sleeping, whether in his wicker basket or in his mother's arms, having only a sunray for his diadem. You who are human like us, the questioner twice interrogates the divine babe. What is your origin and aim? Are you perhaps John the Baptizer, risen from the dead to serve as the new rabbi, a wise example, the new prophet announcing the wrath to come? Such supposals constitute a serious misprision of the Christ child's mission. Gabriel did not announce that she would bear another rabbi, not even one so great as Gamaliel. Thus do we hear, and I think we hear, a second voice making a sudden and perhaps impatient interruption. It is the voice of the Holy Mother, I believe, who halts these clamorous queries, lest the sleeping babe be rudely roused, and lest we too miss the staggering mystery of eternity shut within the span of a man's hand, as Henry Vaughan so memorably says. Surely it is time now to bow in silence, for a child is born. The arena is not, seems to me, so fine a work as the Nativity, though its trochaic meters, its strong caesurae in the third and sixth lines. I'll try to read a couple of those to help you see what I think Chesterton is doing there. Here's how I would read the first stanza. There uprose a golden giant on the gilded house of Nero, even his far-flung flaming shadow, and his image swollen large, looking down on the dry whirlpool of the round arena spinning, as a chariot wheel goes spinning, and the chariot's at this the charge. So that you get that break, clear break in the third and sixth lines. Sorry, here we are. Most notable, even than those fine poetic devices, are the strong Marian sentiments of this poem. It marks Chesterton's 6-week visit here to Notre Dame in 1930, when he lectured on Victorian literature to a full audience of 500 in Washington Hall, which you can still visit here on campus. It was quite an event. It's been commemorated here this semester on the 80th anniversary of it. Some of you know Chesterton was 6'2" and weighed about 325 pounds and wore a big cape as well. And he was, by that time, unable to stand very long because his weight had undone his knees. So he had to sit at a table in Washington Hall. And this was just as the microphone was coming into fashion. And so he sat and delivered these lectures by way of a mic. And his first words at his first lecture, so I've been told, were, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am not as large as I seem. This machine has amplified me." David Solomon tells me a story about Chesterton's fondness for the grape, leading to his inebriation, to the point he could not navigate the stairs back down Washington Hall, so he had to be bodily carried down the stairs of Washington Hall. And Tom Stritch said, "My only claim to fame is I carried Chesterton's left leg." I may have got it wrong. More or less right? Okay. Thank you. They arrived on October 4, and he and Mrs. Chesterton attended the dedication, can you believe it, of the brand new Notre Dame Stadium on October 10. Though I don't think David Solomon's helped me here, I don't think he wrote the poem in the 6 days between 4 and 10, but before he left the campus 6 weeks later. Here's an account of it I found on the net, of all places, that's really wonderful. And John OCallaghan will like this, especially given those of us who heard his speech. Navy had come on for the dedicatory game, and Father Charles O'Donnell, the then university president, was busy with these guests. And the midshipmen were to be led like lambs to the slaughter the next day and defeated 26-2. Well, President O'Donnell had told Johnny Mangan, the university chauffeur, to look after the Chestertons and to make sure that they got into the stadium and that Mr. Chesterton had a seat on the platform from which the speeches were to be made. There were about 20,000 people present. Remember, this is Friday night before the Saturday game. And when the student body saw the magnificent bulk of the 300-pound, 6 feet 2 inch Chesterton going toward the platform, they cheered wildly. "He's a man! Who's a man? He's a Notre Dame man!" Chesterton turned nervously to Mangan, saying, "My, they're angry?" "Angry!" exclaimed Johnny. "Golly, man, they're cheering you." Whereat Chesterton began such a fit of laughing and sputtering as almost to choke himself to death. Well, the two things that fascinated Chesterton about Notre Dame were football and the lady atop the Golden Dome, whom we find here in this poem to be both Mater Dolorosa and Mater Laetabilis, Mother of Sorrows and Mother of Joys. The Queen of Heaven who looks down on the stadium of the world's combat in both grief and gladness. It's very clear that two kinds of gladiators do battle here, and they come to represent two radically opposed ways of life. The pagan culture of death on the one hand, and the Christian culture of life on the other. One delighting in blood sport of those who boast of killing and permanent death, the other delighting in the contest waged by those who die only to live forever. As I read this poem and prepared this lecture, I was struck again by the way in which Chesterton does not cheat in this poem. He doesn't set, for example, the Roman killers of Christians over against their martyrs in the Colosseum. But this would have made the poem, of course, just a historical remembrance on the one hand, and an easy kind of put down of pagan culture killing us good folks, the Christians. We had easy sympathy for these Christian victims and easy contempt for their pagan butchers. Doesn't do that. Instead, Chesterton impersonates the braggart character of the gladiators who slaughtered each other so fiercely that even Nero feared their violence. And here I'm guessing, and here I'm glad to get your help if I'm wrong. I'm not quite sure about the far-flung flaming shadow with the image swollen large in its molten monstrous visage, whether that's Nero himself or Nero's fearful anticipation of Rome's only gladiator emperor. He was the son of Marcus Aurelius, named Lucius Aurelius Commodus, and he ruled from 180 to 192. But it matters not whether these brute slayers are saluting Nero himself or the statue that Commodus erected to himself, boasting that he had slain 12,000 men in this arena's sanguinary sport. For the point remains utterly the same. That is, their Ave, these pagan gladiators, is given to the imperator, the dictator, remember, who was meant to rule for life, but of course who lasted only until he was slain. They hail him as the Lord of life merely because he's sovereign over these death games, with their taunting humor such as their soldier brothers had displayed at the foot of Christ's cross. They find their only life in killing amidst the prison-like circle made of the dust to which they shall return. They know nothing of the enclosed garden named Gethsemane, where Christ had chosen to be killed rather than to kill. Thus do they play out their Liebestod, their death song, their love song of death as on lyres, I think there's a pun there, that cannot be strummed to truthful tunes. And so they salute their potentate of unbridled power, not with lances pointed upward to the freedom of the heavens, but downward to the fates of the underworld ruled by Dis, the god whose gates are guarded by the thrice-headed hound named Cerberus. Little did Chesterton foresee, this is my editorial aside, that this pagan display of panem et circenses would triumph in this very America he was visiting also. For ours too is an arena where men are fed the unsacramental bread of entertainment. And ours too the massive boredom and moral lassitude that leads us to feed beasts with human flesh, whether the tissue be taken from infants left over from our abortuaries or from the corpses left over from our wars. By contrast, the lady who looks down from the main building at Our Lady's University is an empress who presides over another order entirely. Like her son standing below, she beckons all to come unto her as unto him, venite omnes. She gleams in October sun that should be an eschatological sign of the approaching end. Global warming has really messed us up here. Some of us are old enough to remember that it was really cold in October, but an Indian summer reverses the normal course of nature as these warm, sunny days return after frost has already withered the leaves and just before snow will soon fall. Our Lady surveys a scene that is hard for us to imagine. For these are athletic warriors from an earlier and far more innocent day, when football was a sport and not a religion, when coaches were paid less than professors. I discovered that Ara Parsegian, the winningest of all Notre Dame coaches, never earned more than $35,000 a year during his 10 years at Notre Dame. If you want to read a scorching essay on the current Notre Dame coaching salaries, read the late, dear, beloved Ralph McInerney's essay entitled Mammon and Uniquity. as he puns on university and iniquity, mammon and uniquity. It's on the web. Sorry, find my place. Yeah. And I should add, when athletes played more for love of the game than for broken skulls and necks. Yet, given sufficient allowance for its pleasant anachronism, Chesterton's analogy still holds. In this oval stadium is not to be smelled the reek and stench of blood. It has been cleansed by the cheers of a throng whose adversaries are not nemeses, but kinsmen. These young men thus salute their blessed mother as the queen of death, notice, having tearfully and faithfully remained beside her son in his dying. This Mater Dolorosa enables them to fight aright, praying for them now and at the hour of their death. For in her multiplied sorrow she has brought forth the emperor of the good news, and his infinite generosity is given not in beastly satisfaction meant for mobs, but in the Eucharistic meal and the carnival of eternal life. Gilded with the love that moves the sun and the other stars, the Lady of the Victories wields no sword herself. Instead, this gentlest of all creatures. Another editorial aside. Chesterton thinks, he has a poem called The Party Question, that the chief mistake of the Protestant Reformation was the denigration of the Virgin Mary. This gentlest of all creatures blazes with the ardor that prompts her warriors to enter the arena of both death and life, ever so gaily. They prompt shouts that are stronger than the winds howling off the Indiana plains. This Christian crowd sends up a volley not of gunfire, but of cheers so raucous that they shake down the thunder from the sky. And in hailing the fighting athletes of Notre Dame, these football fans ineluctably salute the God-bearer when they cry, "Go Notre Dame!" Our Lady alone mothered the Lord, who conquers all those who would pretend to be lords of the world, and most especially the false light-bearer called Lucifer. These chivalrous combatants of the Blessed Mother are thus the gladiators of God. They wield the sword of the Spirit by refusing to torment even their enemies, combating them without sneering, laughing without desiring to wound. They carry no burden at all, except the one burden that is most lightsome, the yoke that is easy because it is imposed by the world's true imperator, the Christus Victor, who masters men from a gibbet, the sovereign who cannot be defeated, because, as Chesterton says in The Ball and the cross is defeat itself, uppercase D. Even as he hung from Golgotha, Jesus remained his mother's child. He in turn declares her to be the mother of a new son, the beloved John. And as the exemplary disciple, he represents all other Christian sons and daughters who have been given this new mother. In the last years of his life, when Chesterton began to have long thoughts about lasting things, he returned again to the Blessed Virgin. In one of his last and best books, The Well and the Shallows, and by the way, David Fagerberg first put me onto this, if he's here or not, Chesterton made what I regard as his deepest Marian confession. It is a reminder that just as it is impossible to speak of Christ apart from his body, so is it impossible to speak of the church apart from the Mother of God. I'm quoting Chesterton. Now I can scarcely remember a time when the image of Our Lady did not stand up in my mind quite definitely as the mention of the thought of all these things. He's been talking about various Catholic things. But whether the figure was distant or was dark and mysterious, or was a scandal to my contemporaries, or was a challenge to myself. I never doubted that this Marian figure was the figure of the faith, uppercase F. The instant I remembered the Catholic Church, I remembered her. When I tried to forget about the Catholic Church, I had to forget about her. When I finally saw what was nobler than my fate, the freest and the hardest of all my acts of freedom, it was in front of a gilded and very gaudy little image of her in the port of Brindisi. There I promised the thing that I would do if I returned to my own land. Chesterton refers to a tour of Italy that he had made in 1920. Not until 2 years later, at age 48, would he and his wife Frances be received into the Roman Catholic Church. Almost everyone knows that G.K. Chesterton was the most celebrated convert of his time. Few know, however, that he was also a Marian poet whose verse has yet to be reckoned with. Thank you.
I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Ralph, do you want to perhaps stay out here,
sure.
and I'll try to recognize people. Please come to the microphone and speak loudly.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wood. I think that Chesterton would have heartily approved of your interpretation. I mentioned something only because you had the humility to mention several times in your talk that you were hoping to be corrected on something. I thought that I liked your bringing out the Mary's torn hair. I think that brings out an aspect that Chesterton wanted to play up of what was in British English called homeliness. It's not the same meaning we have now, but similar to the meaning that you described with regard to the way that he envisioned the Mary statue, Mary as mother. I just wanted to mention that with regard to what you said about her great pain and torn flesh, you had mentioned the various Marian doctrines, and I would just invite you to research what the magisterium has said with regard to Mary being Virgo intacta. It has to do with her being the new Eve and with her birth marking an absolute beginning without sin.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Good.
Ralph, do you have any?
I have just one comment, not about that so much, but about something I, though talking way too long, forgot to mention. And that is that I discovered only a couple of years ago that the Ukrainian icons of the Pentecost have Mary presiding over Pentecost as she sits enthroned with the disciples having the tongues of flame on their head. I'd never, again, everyone in the room would have seen that, but I'd never seen an icon of Pentecost with Mary presiding over it. Yes?
Recently, I came across a beautiful painting, medieval painting of the Nativity, and it was called "A Child is Given to Us, a Son is Born to Us." And the child was in a field outside of a village. And the importance of the painting seemed to be that we are to fall in love with Jesus beginning from his nativity. And I'm wondering if you know anything about that in our history.
I defer to someone who does. I don't. John, do you happen to know?
State it again.
I was wondering if there is any history of the Nativity, the celebration of the Nativity, that focuses on our falling in love with the Christ child because a son is given to us. A child is born. A son is born to us. A child is given to us. I forget the precise wording of that, but it's scripture.
You know, honestly, I don't know. I wonder if there's so many people here who would have knowledge of this or some knowledge of it. Is there anyone in the auditorium who might have a sense for that? Catherine? Go to the microphone. We can't hear you.
Maybe in the adoration of the shepherds.
Speak right into the
Sorry,
mic.
in the adoration of the shepherds, probably, and the Magi. I mean, I would think the imagery that I've seen throughout the Middle Ages and all that, we're invited to identify specifically with the Magi, but I think, well, mostly with the shepherds, actually. We're supposed to, like the sort of prompt for this conference said, we're supposed to humble ourselves like the shepherds. So I think if we're meant to fall in love with Jesus through the iconography, we identify with the shepherds. Thoughts on that?
Yeah. Now that you mentioned that, I'm thinking that's probably something like that. There's so much medieval art portraying the Nativity with particularly not exalted views of the shepherds, but in fact you have angels, right? Very exalted angels, not the little cherubs, but very exalted angels. But then you have these very humble shepherds. In fact, I've seen one that, for various reasons I was looking at, that some people argue has the earliest portrayals of people with Down syndrome in Western art. Because two of the shepherds, looking in through the window, they're looking in sort of with a kind of joy in their face, have clearly the symptoms of Down syndrome as displayed in the face. But they're sort of peeking in as if, look at this wonderful thing. So yeah, I would think that would be it in the iconography of the shepherds. Yes?
First of all, it was a very amazing and humbling and somewhat surreal experience to be so beautifully instructed on the Blessed Mother by a Baptist. Thank you for that.
Dude.
He does call himself a Bapto-Catholic, by the way.
That's a term I invented, by the way.
It's fantastic. Growing up as a Catholic, there were statues of the Blessed Mother in my bedroom. My mother is a devotee out in the front yard in the garden. So obviously for us, she played a place of honor. My high school friends were Protestants. I'm wondering if you can point to one thing, maybe, and I don't buy personally that it's Marian dogma, but one thing that made them maybe so vehement to Catholics, in the sense that Mary played such a high role of honor in our religion and our faith. While I wrote my senior research paper on abortion, the pro-life polemic, my Baptist friend, almost as an attack on me, wrote it on Mariolatry. I was an idolater, and it seems that Mary should play a place of honor in even Protestant denominations and Protestant faith, even if they don't accept our dogma, our Marian dogma. I'm wondering how is it that she almost seems to have been erased as a person, an honorable person, among Protestant denominations?
Well, I have several members of the Baptist Church that we all attend in common in Waco, and we do that in a couple of ways. One of our dearest friends who works with the children, Andrea Moore can testify this, came to me and said, how can we really mark the imaginations of our very young children in a decidedly Christian way when they're being bombarded with every notion that's counter to that? I said, give them the icons. So we have icons displayed in most of our Sunday school rooms, and of course they're mainly from the Eastern Church, where of course the Theotokos is given huge prominence. And then secondly, you won't believe this, we celebrate the Stations of the Cross on Good Friday, the 8 biblical stations, which His Holiness Pope John Paul II, as you know, pared down for the Church Universal from the original 14. And of course that includes the scene at the end where Mary is very much present. Those are 2 ways we do that.
Well, it's...
Ann Astral had a question.
Oh, Ann? Are you here? Sister Ann?
I was just going to chime in on an example about falling in love with the child Jesus. There's many examples from medieval women mystics where Mary actually presents her child, to like Matilda of Hagaborg, for instance, as a gift to the nun, the mystic, that she may love the child as her own. And so that gift of the child is really given to all of us to love. So, but and I'm sure if we thought more about it, we could come up with many, many examples of that.
Thank you. I should add that my paper was so long because, as my friends know, I'm a coward and did not want many questions. Yeah. So I didn't leave time for them.
It is 12:06, and I know they like us to get down for lunch. I would like to say a sincere and heartfelt thank you to Ralph for that wonderful paper. I think it displays why those of us here at Notre Dame recognize that he is certainly one of the most loyal sons of Notre Dame.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Ralph.
Well, that was fun. I mean,
Well, no,
that was